It was a trial to my feelings, on the next day but one, to see Joe arraying himself in his Sunday clothes to accompany me to Miss Havisham's. However, as he thought his court suit necessary to the occasion, it was not for me to tell him that he looked far better in his working dress, the rather because I knew he made himself so dreadfully uncomfortable entirely on my account, and that it was for me he pulled up his shirt-collar so very high behind that it made the hair on the crown of his head stand up like a tuft of feathers. At breakfast-time my sister declared her intention of going to town with us, and being left at Uncle Pumblechook's, and called for, "when we had done with our fine ladies," a way of putting the case, from which Joe appeared inclined to augur the worst. The forge was shut up for the day, and Joe inscribed in chalk upon the door, as it was his custom to do on the very rare occasions when he was not at work, the monosyllable H-O-U-T, accompanied by a sketch of an arrow supposed to be flying in the direction he had taken. We walked to town, my sister leading the way in a very large beaver bonnet, and carrying a basket like the great seal of England in plaited straw, a pair of pattens, a spare shawl, and an umbrella, though it was a fine bright day. I am not quite clear whether these articles were carried penitentially or ostentatiously, but I rather think they were displayed as articles of property, much as Cleopatra or any other sovereign lady on the rampage might exhibit her wealth in a pageant or procession. When we came to Pumblechook's, my sister bounced in and left us. As it was almost noon, Joe and I held straight on to Miss Havisham's house. Estella opened the gate as usual, and the moment she appeared, Joe took his hat off and stood weighing it by the brim in both his hands, as if he had some urgent reason in his mind for being particular to 1/2 of an ounce. Estella took no notice of either of us, but led us the way that I knew so well. I followed next to her, and Joe came last. When I looked back at Joe in the long passage, he was still weighing his hat with the greatest care, and was coming after us in long strides on the tips of his toes. Estella told me we were both to go in, so I took Joe by the coat cuff and conducted him into Miss Havisham's presence. She was seated at her dressing-table, and looked round at us immediately. "Oh," said she to Joe, "you are the husband of the sister of this boy?" I could hardly have imagined dear old Joe looking so unlike himself, or so like some extraordinary bird, standing as he did, speechless, with his tuft of feathers ruffled, and his mouth open, as if he wanted a worm. "You are the husband," repeated Miss Havisham, "of the sister of this boy?" It was very aggravating, but throughout the interview Joe persisted in addressing me instead of Miss Havisham. "Which I mean to say, Pip," Joe now observed in a manner that was at once expressive of forcible argumentation, strict confidence, and great politeness, "as I up and married your sister, and I were at the time what you might call, if you were anyways inclined, a single man." "Well," said Miss Havisham, "and you have reared the boy with the intention of taking him for your apprentice. Is that so, Mr. Goggery?" "You know, Pip," replied Joe, "as you and me were ever friends, and it were looked forward to betwixt us, as being calculated to lead to larks. Not but what, Pip, if you ever had made objections to the business, such as its being open to black and soot, and such like, not but what they would have had been attended to, don't you see?" "Has the boy," said Miss Havisham, "ever made any objection? Does he like the trade?" "Which it is well beknown to yourself, Pip," returned Joe, strengthening his former mixture of argumentation, confidence, and politeness, "that it were the wish of your own heart. I saw the idea suddenly break upon him that he would adapt his epitaph to the occasion, before he went on to say, "And there weren't no objection on your part, and Pip, it were the great wish of your heart." It was quite in vain for me to endeavour to make him sensible that he ought to speak to Miss Havisham. The more I made faces and gestures to him to do it, the more confidential, argumentative, and polite he persisted in being to me. "Have you brought his indentures with you?" asked Miss Havisham. "Well, Pip, you know," replied Joe, as if that were a little unreasonable, "you yourself see me put 'em in my hat, and therefore you know as they are here." With which he took them out and gave them, not to Miss Havisham, but to me. I am afraid I was ashamed of the dear good fellow. I know I was ashamed of him. When I saw that Estella stood at the back of Miss Havisham's chair, and that her eyes laughed mischievously, I took the indentures out of his hand and gave them to Miss Havisham. "You expected," said Miss Havisham, as she looked them over, "no premium with the boy?" "Joe," I remonstrated, for he made no reply at all, "why don't you answer?" "Pip," returned Joe, cutting me short as if he were hurt, "which I mean to say that were not a question requiring an answer betwixt yourself and me, and which you know the answer to be full well no. You know it to be no, Pip, and wherefore should I say it?" Miss Havisham glanced at him as if she understood what he really was better than I had thought possible, seeing what he was there, and took up a little bag from the table beside her. "Pip has earned a premium here," she said, "and here it is. There are 25 guineas in this bag. Give it to your master, Pip." As if he were absolutely out of his mind with the wonder awakened in him by her strange figure and the strange room, Joe, even at this pass, persisted in addressing me. "This is very liberal on your part, Pip," said Joe, "and it is as such received and grateful welcome, though never looked for, far nor near, nor nowheres. And now, old chap," said Joe, conveying to me a sensation, first of burning and then of freezing, for I felt as if that familiar expression were applied to Miss Havisham, "and now, old chap, may we do our duty. May you and me do our duty, both on us, by one and another, and by them which your liberal present have conveyed to be, for the satisfaction of mind of them as never—" Here Joe showed that he felt he had fallen into frightful difficulties, until he triumphantly rescued himself with the words, "and from myself far be it." These words had had such a round and convincing sound for him that he said them twice. "Good-bye, Pip," said Miss Havisham. "Let them out, Estella." "Am I to come again, Miss Havisham?" I asked. "No, Gargery is your master now. Gargery, one word." Thus calling him back as I went out of the door, I heard her say to Joe in a distinct, emphatic voice, "The boy has been a good boy here, and that is his reward. Of course, as an honest man, you will expect no other and no more." How Joe got out of the room I have never been able to determine, but I know that when he did get out he was steadily proceeding upstairs instead of coming down, and was deaf to all remonstrances until I went after him and laid hold of him. In another minute we were outside the gate, and it was locked, and Estella was gone. When we stood in the daylight alone again, Joe backed up against a wall and said to me, "Astonishing!" And there he remained so long, saying "astonishing" at intervals so often, that I began to think his senses were never coming back. At length he prolonged his remark into, "Pip, I do assure you this is astonishing. and so by degrees became conversational and able to walk away. I have reason to think that Joe's intellects were brightened by the encounter they had passed through, and that on our way to Pumblechook's he invented a subtle and deep design. My reason is to be found in what took place in Mr. Pumblechook's parlor, where, on our presenting ourselves, my sister sat in conference with that detested seedsman.
"Well,